Hello. If you've been watching my Marienburg diaries, you will know that I'm building an Empire army for the Old World and for Warhammer Fantasy Battle, inspired by the great port city of Marienburg. I have also been writing a set of fiction to accompany that army that tells the tale of the family of its general. I will be reading that for you today. I'm Jordan, this is Jordan Sorcery, and today I'm reading The Widow Trudot, Part 1. (2276) Imperial Calendar. An unseasonably cold spring in the Reinauld Valley, betwixt the Empire, the Wasteland, and Bretonnia. Did you ever drink the 2262 Morceau Red? They say the vintage was blessed by a passing comet. It's the finest Bretonnian grape you'll ever taste. Reinauld asked this question with the casual informality of an old friend, despite the fact that he had known the Mistress Trudot less than 4 weeks in total, and even despite the fact that he worked for her. Possibly it was because he was an old gardener, before that an old soldier, and he no longer had time to waste on formalities or empty platitudes. More than that, though, the two had quickly fallen into a friendly rapport almost as soon as she had taken up residence at the Trudot vineyard, and now that he was back at the estate, they had continued their easy fellowship. This was the least stuck-up noble old Reinauld had ever known. When could you afford a glass of any Bretonnian wine, Reinauld? Let alone a Morceau. We don't pay you enough for more than a Rhineland hock, and a watery one at that, the mistress fired back. She liked Reinauld. The old man had been with the Trudot family his whole life. He was a hard worker, but even with his experience, this place had barely turned a profit in all that time. Not least because he and the other staff kept getting dragooned into the military expeditions of the Trudot family. Quite, Reinauld agreed. And it's especially heartening to hear your employer tell you that they know they're paying you a pittance. Be that as it may, though, I was awarded a bottle for my actions in the defence of the valley during the Black Summer. The Lord of Reinauld was particularly gratified that I saved his prized horse from a vicious goat-headed monstrosity. I think it meant to take the mare as its bride. As Reinauld carried on, the Mistress Trudot knelt down, trowel in hand, to try and get better purchase on the earth. It was cold for this time of year, terribly cold, and the ground was frozen in places that should have long since thawed. In any other year, the gentle warmth of Mitterfrühl would already be felt by now. The Pale Sisters to the northwest never shook off their snowy shawls, but it was rare for their ice-cold breath to blow with such persistence in the low-lying valleys. If they were unable to turn the soil now, then there would be little hope of the next seedlings taking root. This entire field might run fallow for another season, and that would bring financial disaster. Again. "Answer me this, Reinauld," she began, cutting off the gardener's wistful ramblings. "If the Lord of the Reinauld Valley were to grant you such a boon, and your pay is so meagre as to impoverish your life and enfeeble your body, why would you not sell the bottle for the small fortune it was surely worth?" "Ah, but there are some rewards worth more than coin, Mistress Trudot. They are moments meant to be savoured. Well, even if I were to grant that this tale is true, which I do not, the Lord of Reinauld has never been that generous, then I would suggest that you could have done better than to uncork and drink that uncommonly favoured vintage with such mindless alacrity. Though I am compelled to ask, if it was real, did it taste good?" Reinauld laughed to himself and nodded heartily to her, whilst he watched as she struggled to dig at the compacted earth. "As if the grapes were pressed by Sigmar's very feet, mistress." It was another trait that he had admired in this unusual noble. She was not afraid to dirty her hands. A trait that was especially needed at the Trudot estate. The master was a fine young man, but he and his father before him had no mind for the wine business, and they had not been able to arrest the fall in their family's fortunes. The vineyards could no longer afford the necessary workers to plant, pick, and press their wines, which was a mercifully rare problem these days, as each season no longer produced enough grapes to press in the first place. In the past 5 years, Ponsard had spent more time and money campaigning than he had days or guilders on the estate. And whilst Reinauld had stood by his master's side in every battle, for he was no less than the loyal captain of the Trudot vinekeepers, it had been hard for him to stay so long away from his precious, dying fields. Even though this land would only yield wine that was as bitter as the work it took to grow it, Reinauld would always be a vintner in his heart, and a soldier only in his purse. You know, Reinauld, any other groundskeeper would probably dig the earth themselves rather than letting the delicate new mistress of the house get down in the dirt on her own. Reinauld snorted with a half-laugh and replied, I already know better than to step between you and something you've set yourself to. And besides, I'm a vinekeeper, not a groundskeeper. When something grows in this dirt, then I'll tend it. Well, that seems tautological to me, but I'm pleased at least that despite the work boots, muddy hands, and grim determination, you don't dispute my self-proclaimed delicacy, said Mistress Trudot as she rose to her feet, hands covered in sludgy clumps of the frozen ground that had melted from her efforts. As she wiped them down her apron, a smile played across her face. For all the loot and scuffle that this estate would take to get in any kind of shape, she was already excited by the prospect. Plans filled her mind, overlapping and reworking themselves constantly with every new discovery of an abandoned farmhouse, a fallow field, or an untapped water source. It had been several decades, maybe more, since the Trudot estate had produced anything better than low-quality grape and grain, and longer still since there had been enough produce to sell beyond the local villages. A bottle of Trudot couldn't have been served in the guild halls of Marienburg or even the squalid ten-tailed cat of Talabheim in over 100 years. She was going to change that, even if she had to personally rebuild the winery one brick at a time. As she looked at the short, aging vinekeeper beside her, she considered whether he would be an aid to this newfound purpose. He was well acquainted with the Trudot lands, and he knew well his wine. But under his stewardship, the vineyard had suffered a long and drawn-out decline. Would this man be capable of the change and innovation she knew would be required to save this place? Could he embrace the plans she was making, and the methods she had been studying for years? Or would he be as unyielding as the frozen dirt beneath her feet, unwilling to give up even an inch of its grit? Back home in the great merchant city of Marienburg, the Mistress Trudot had encountered all manner of wines, liquors, and ales. Her father was a trader in the exotic liquids, and she had grown up in the shadow of countless sacred casks. Rarely had she been able to sample them, but when she had, it was the wine that had left the greatest impression. Sea Elf Aqua Algia, a clear sweet green wine made using saltwater irrigation that gave the feeling of such exquisite lightheadedness, with no ill effects the next morning. Bretonnian vintages that possessed an aroma of such beauty that they equalled as art the most ornate Loretian tapestries. Or the stone wine of the dwarves, made with methods that eluded even the greatest human makers. Crops grown in caves and deeply infused with spices and fire. Now that did leave a mark the next day, and the following week. In the merchant yards of her family, she had heard of the greatest successes, the champion vintages, and the legendary winehouses from across the empire. She knew that she could make Trudot into one of those houses, provided there was enough money to invest in the enterprise. Already the dowry she had come to the estate with had largely been spent equipping and recruiting a sizable mercenary force, l'Armée Trudot. Yet this was not a problem for her. As far as the Mistress Trudot was concerned, Ponsard could keep soldiering on as long as he liked. He was good at it, his recent disastrous campaign notwithstanding. And if his passion was for war, then she was happy he had found it. Her passion was for wine, though, and she just hoped he wouldn't bankrupt the family by chasing fortune before she could make some. In the time she had spent with him, Ponsard already seemed to be a good man, driven and strong and clever, and kind too, thankfully. He was known to be an excellent fighter and a reasonable wit, and many would likely think him confident and perhaps even cocksure. Yet in their few nights together, it was already clear that he merely put on an impressive show. He was far from conceited. If anything, he was anxious and unsure about his choices and his deeds. The considerable strain he bore from the pressures of his birthright played on him constantly. Like the family's wine, its name had become mired in the dirt. Generations of debauched, vainglorious fools had spent the family money like it would never run out, squandering resources on follies and fripperies. They had paid soldiers to wage pointless wars and ignored their own responsibilities in favour of sumptuous parties. By the time Ponsard's father had taken over the family seat, it was all but too late. The money was gone. It was only the successful and noteworthy campaigns pressed by his son that had kept any hope of a positive future for the Trudot name alive. Trudot had once been a byword in the empire for fine culture and elegant sophistication, a name that evoked the best heritage of both Bretonnian blood and imperial ingenuity and hard work. With Ponsard's steel and his wife's wine, maybe it could be so once more. Of course, he first must recover from his wounds, and then there was a list of jobs for him to undertake around the estate that the mistress had been compiling. There was much for him to do before he could even consider setting forth to war once again. The mistress Trudot didn't think a sojourn away from the battle lines would be an issue now, though. After all, Ponsard's star may well have waxed somewhat after his recent efforts. Some time out of the public gaze might be wise. The Margrave of the Bitter Moors had been tasked to find a suitable noble to send into the wasteland swamps. A litany of whispers and lies, tall tales and half-truths had put many people on edge. Stories of rats that walked like men, and one-eyed fairy folk that kidnapped children. Ponsard, of course, immediately volunteered himself and L'armée Trudot for a mission into the swamps to search out any such fiends that might be skulking there. Success in this would mean yet another high-profile victory, and a step closer to the Trudot family once again being acceptable company at the most exclusive balls in the city. So it had been that a mercenary company marched into that mist-shrouded swamp under the banners and bills of the Trudot family. For weeks there was no word, and then a frightening flurry of action took over the estate. Ponsard had gotten himself stabbed in the stomach by some kind of swamp orc spear. Reinauld had dragged his master back from the murk and muss of the swamp and into his convalescence bed, where Ponsard had been resting these past 2 weeks. What was left of the fighting force was disbanded, and the report was sent to the Margrave of the campaign's unfortunate failure. The whole endeavour was a humiliation to the family, a significant setback to Ponsard's aims, and whilst the mistress cared not for any of it, for she knew glory would return from the uncorking of a bottle, not the unsheathing of a sword, she also knew that it would affect Ponsard keenly once he was well enough to dwell on it. Without evidence of success in the swamps, there would be no higher commission for Ponsard, nor any recompense for the guilders the family had spent lavishly on their mercenary company. More's the pity, because a sponsorship from the Margrave would have done wonders for the Trudot mark. And that was something the Mistress Trudot did care about. As it was, only on the banners of the vinekeepers could you find the crest of the Trudot family. They couldn't even afford to paint wine labels anymore. And yet, covered in cold grime, surrounded by withered vines and unplanted earth, and with only an old soldier, a wet-nosed stable boy, and an unreasonably stern halfling cook left in the household, the Mistress Trudot stood beaming like the vineyard's own personal son. She would nourish this place with her own indomitable will. She had no doubt about it. Even Reinauld couldn't help but be impressed by something in her attitude. "Tell me, Reinauld, how many acres can we call Trudot land?" she asked. With a quizzical look, Reinauld answered her plainly. 38, cultivated. "And how many uncultivated acres?" His confusion only grew as he answered. "But surely you know all this, Mistress Trudot. I can't imagine someone such as yourself entering a marriage without knowing your prospects. Humour me, Reinauld." "Very well. The uncultivated land on the estate proper runs to 100 acres, bordered on 2 sides by the river and 1 by the road to Reinauld village. Over the river, by the forest lands, We have the dormant plains, which make for another 293 acres at least. And then there is the tenanted land along the north side of the valley. I would imagine that could be as much as another 1,000 acres, though that could never be cultivated in any meaningful way, owing to the shale and the screed. So, with some effort, we could probably cultivate 393 acres. All we need to do is bring the land back from the dead, irrigate it, and manage it effectively. With a lot of help and a decade of works, perhaps, yes. And what facilities do we have in which to do this work? Well, beside the mansion, the keeper and staff cottages, there's a number of outhouses, barns, and stables. The winery has seen better days, but both it and the old granary are robust. With some care, they could work again. And that's not to mention the sheds and shacks that dot the estate, or the barracks, correct? Correct. Well, Reinauld, that seems like a great deal of land, if you ask me, and a great deal of opportunity. That it is, mistress, though even measureless opportunity is worth nothing if you cannot harvest it. Much of that earth is barren and untended for decades. The soil has grown weak and lifeless. What land has been seeded barely produces more than a handful of bottles these days. Speaking frankly, though I love them like brother and son, I cannot say that the master nor his father have ever been great wine men. It just isn't in their blood. Money that should have been spent on the grape fields was spent on the battlefields, and the family Trudot became enamoured of drawing blood rather than wine. You forget yourself, Reinauld. You are speaking about my husband, master of this estate and holder of the title of Trudot, responded the mistress sharply in answer to Reinaud's astonishing candour. She was surprised by how forcefully she had spoken. Instinct had taken over, and she had reflexively leaned on her birthright and that of her husband's. Perhaps, she thought to herself, she was not as enlightened as she liked to believe. After a moment of tense silence, she continued, more gently in tone. Is winemaking in your blood, Reinauld? You've worked this land all along, and had the trust of both masters. Even if their thoughts were elsewhere, surely you could have steered the estate to prosperity on their behalf. You are right, mistress, I apologize. Reinauld suddenly looked frail and cowed. He may be a brave soldier and a forthright gardener, but more than anything, he was a liegeman of the Trudot family, and he was horrified to have disappointed the mistress by insulting the master. I am an old man now, and I have been known to misspeak. These lands have long been entrusted to me, and the failure is mine alone. Please, forgive me. The mistress Trudot stood silent for a moment more, and then, with good humour, said, Your apology is accepted, Reinauld. By Sigmar, we've got a great deal of work ahead of us. I won't waste time holding grudges. A look of relief swept over Reinaud's face, and with a nod and a grunt, he agreed. She continued, Mark me, Reinauld. Even with the 393 acres of good land we already possess, in 5 years' time, I'll be entrusting you with a purse full of gold and a mission to buy us a great deal more. I've plans for this place, and a vision for what it will become. Well, with your vision and my shovel, mistress, I have high hopes. Though I would welcome the odd miracle as well. After all, the last time Trudot wine was in fashion, it took a comet from Sigmar himself to sweeten the harvest. Ah, the famous comet year. That must have been nearly a century hence, no? And then some. A gift sent from the firmament to the ferment. Every house turned out its greatest vintage that year. Even the 62 Morceaux would pale in comparison. Well, we can't summon comets from the sky any more than we can afford armies of vinekeepers to tend the crop. So until the stable boy is old enough to handle the shears, this is going to be you, me, and Ponsard for quite a while. And we've got work to do, Reinauld. A lot of work. I hope there's still strength in that old back of yours. If I can carry Ponsard Trudot on my shoulders for 100 leagues, then I can carry this estate on them for a little while as well. Don't you worry, mistress. Good. And Reinauld, do call me Anna. Mistress is going to get terribly tedious when we're fighting over the viticulture. Very well, mistress, Reinauld said. before hesitating for just a moment, unsure if he should say more. And yet, he was compelled to speak. Despite his recent brush with awkward truth, for some reason the words just flowed from him. I've worked for this family since I could walk, and I'll work for you until I can't even stand. There have been few times in my life happier than when I've been working this land. I've known a little glory in battle, certainly, and on occasion a little love as well. Sharing that bottle of 62 Morceau, that was a moment indeed. But I've never been blessed with a family of my own, at least not in the traditional sense. I wasn't sure what Pierre expected from me when he offered me a job on his winery. I was just a local boy without prospects. But I've been thankful ever since he did. It wasn't just his estate that he invited me to join, and I've been harvesting the opportunity he offered me ever since. Today, it's Ponsard Trudot that I owe my life to, and now I owe it to you too, Mistress Trudot. Anna. Though separated by class, age, and experience, the two figures in that barren field stood together as colleagues. Both had been brought into the Trudot family through circumstances external to themselves, and no matter how typical such transactions might be, it could still take time and effort to find a place to fit in. Anna regarded Reinauld for a moment, this time humbled by his sudden, unprompted honesty. She was about to share something of her own, but caught herself. Even despite their growing friendship, this old man was still her vassal, and a confidant of her husband. Some secrets must remain one's own. As Anna Trudot knelt down ready to tackle the stolid earth once again, a gentle cry came wafting over the field. Springing to her feet at the unusual sound, Anna looked first to Reinauld, whose expression noted the sound as well, and then she looked towards the mansion. A small figure was running in their direction. Coming as quickly as his feet would carry him was Pottage the stable boy. At barely 11, and being a little rotund from all the extra bread that cook would feed him, he didn't run quickly, even at maximum charge. What's more, he wore a crazed expression on his face as he shouted something repeatedly. Whatever he wanted must be quite urgent and quite serious. The distance between Pottage and the two figures in the field was still considerable, but he had clearly begun to slow as he ran out of stamina, and eventually he came to a complete stop and doubled over to take comically deep breaths. Anna and Reinauld, confused by his sudden and dramatic appearance, and mildly amused by how quickly he'd run out of steam, started towards the boy. Anna shouted across the gulf, "What is it, boy? Why such a rumpus?" The boy, when he'd recovered enough to shout back, threw his voice as far as he could. Reinaud's back may still be strong, but his hearing isn't what it once was. He didn't hear most of the young lad's bellowed words. Anna had, though, and in an instant she dropped the trowel from her hand and ran at her own top speed towards the house. Her sun hat flew from her head, and yet she took no heed, determined as she was to make it back to the house immediately. As Reinauld finally understood the words Pottage kept bawling out, he looked to the unyielding, frozen earth and muttered to himself mournfully, "And now I owe my life to you only, mistress." Pottage the stable boy stood in the middle of the field, dishevelled and out of breath, and even as the mistress of the house ran past him at full speed, he continued shouting with all of his strength, "The master is dead." I hope that you've enjoyed part 1 of the Widow Trudot. If you can't wait for the next audio reading of part 2, you can read it right now on my website via the link in the description below. Thank you very much for watching. I'm Jordan, and this is Jordan Sorcery.